You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Hello, and welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. Since I started the show, one aspect of cryptozoology I've always wanted to dive into is the work being carried out by the Olympic Project. This collective have intrigued me for years, and unlike some, tend to work quietly and diligently, collating as much serious evidence in the field of hominid research as possible. So, I'm delighted to spoil this week with not one or two, but three guests. We have Shane Corson and David Ellis from the Olympic Project, and film director Darcy Weir. Darcy's latest documentary, Sasquatch Among Wildmen, is available across numerous video platforms and looks at the various hominids around the world and includes a section looking at the work Shane and David are doing with the Olympic Project. David has also kindly supplied me with some incredible audio recordings which we feature in the show as well. It was also fantastic to finally speak with Shane with his outstanding reputation in the field as well as his work on the Monster X podcast. One of the clips David supplied me is classed as percussive speech. The audio I'm about to play was captured right after a Sasquatch was seen walking between two trees. This occurred at dusk, with just enough light to see the silhouette. David didn't realise what he'd recorded until later analysis, but this showed that the clicks and pops were mixed with huffs and grunts, giving it a cadence of speech, and this is where David began to develop the notion of percussive speech. It's looped 5 times, so see what you think. Now that's a remarkable piece of audio, so a big thank you for David for supplying that, amongst the many others that we play in this week's episode. A big thank you to all three, David, Shane and Darcy, for joining me on this week's show. The Mysteries and Monsters website is finally live. You can find us at mysteriesandmonsters.com, so please check it out, let me know some feedback, and you can also message us direct through the contact details on the site. You can also support the show via our Patreon. You can sign up in the show notes as usual for just $4 a month for early releases, extra episodes and prize draws starting from this month. You can find us across all social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. Artwork as always for this week's show is by Dean Bestel. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Now, let's take a journey deep into the heart of the Olympic region, on the hunt for Sasquatch. I am delighted to be joined by 3 phenomenal guests. Firstly, we have filmmaker Darcy Weir, who is the creator of one of my favourite Bigfoot documentaries in the last few years, The Unwanted Sasquatch, which features some fabulous interviews and archive footage. I'm also delighted to welcome 2 gentlemen heavily involved in the Olympic Project, Shane Corson and David Ellis. Both gentlemen are 2 of the most respected Bigfoot investigators in the field, and Shane hosts one of my favourite Bigfoot podcasts, Monster X Radio. Gentlemen, welcome one and all.
Thank you for having us. Really excited to be here, Paul.
Looking forward to it, Paul.
Yep, thank you.
So, firstly, I am delighted to finally get somebody who is involved in the Olympic Project on my show. As someone that is a massive fan of all things Bigfoot, I've been aware of the Olympic project and its aims and the way it's run for quite a while. So I know, David and Shane, you're primarily heavily involved in it. Shane, you're more often than not out in the field looking for new discoveries. And David, I believe you are sort of the go-to guy for any kind of audio evidence that's captured in the field.
I've kind of migrated toward that direction, Paul, yes.
So how did you both get into it? Because I know, David, you're someone who's grown up in the Bigfoot hotspots of the Pacific Northwest. So you had a personal encounter as a child that kind of enthused your intrigue in regards to this subject?
Correct. Yeah. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my grandfather told a story. He had an 80-acre farm in the state of Washington near a little town called Battleground, Washington. This was probably in the 40s, early 50s when this happened, but he was cutting hay on a summer's day, and up popped what he described to us in the story as a 5-foot-tall monkey. Stood on two legs, ran across the field, hopped the fence, and into the woods. So since I've been about 5 or 6 years old, I've had this notion that there's monkeys in the woods. So as I've grown older, I've come to realize that, there aren't 5-foot-tall monkeys in Battleground, Washington. And we always grilled Grandpa exactly what did he mean by 5-foot-tall monkey, because, like, Grandpa, where did the monkey come from? Well, it must have escaped from the zoo or the circus. Well, what circus? And the zoo's in Portland. So it didn't make much sense, and he didn't really have any answers, but I'm pretty sure I know what he experienced. And then fast forward to when I'm about 11 years old, we also lived out in the country. We lived about 5 miles due south of his property, actually. And there was a 40-acre field that we used to play in as children. The street gang would always, it seems like we'd end up in this place called the Stump Field, which was a 40-acre cow pasture. And obviously we had to negotiate the cows when we were in there, but it had been a logged old forest. And they used the spring and buckboard method to cut the trees, leaving these 12 to 15 foot tall edifices that we called, the stump field, because it was literally a forest that had been cut down and now turned into a pasture. So we're in this field, a group of us, and we're migrating from one end to the other. And I had noticed that the cows had kind of drifted off to a different corner. And I thought, well, that's great. We don't have to deal with any pesky cows getting a little frisky with us. So we're headed towards this fence line, and we're maybe 10 yards, 30 feet from the fence line. I was personally, but there was another gentleman that one of the kids picked up a stick and banged it on one of the overhanging limbs. On the other side of the fence, it was just this brush and dense forest. You couldn't really see anything into it. But I did notice that all of a sudden, alder trees about the size of maybe 12 to 18 inches in diameter were swaying vigorously. No wind, but they were really moving. And I thought, that is really weird. And so it had caught my attention. And the next thing I noticed were limbs that were being ripped off of the tree. And they were about 2 inches in diameter, and just this crashing, ripping sound and trees shaking. And I'm wondering what in the heck is going on. And then whatever it was, we couldn't see it, but it let loose a scream that I later described to my parents as a cross between a lion roaring, it had that depth to it, and a elephant trumpeting. It had a higher tone to it as well. So it was literally a scream that I had never heard before. I knew what an elephant sounded like. I had been to the Portland Zoo. I knew what a lion sounded like. I'd also heard a lion. So I had some frame of reference for what this vocalization sounded like to me at the time, but it lasted about 10 to 12 seconds. And so whatever it was that screamed, this really had some lung power. And the next thing I realized is that I'm on the ground. It's kind of like maybe I fainted. I don't really know. but I ended up, getting up and I said, run. And so everybody ran on home. Described when I got my dad said I literally almost tore the screen door off of the hinges trying to get into the house. So it was caused quite a commotion, and he wanted to know what the heck was going on, and I tried to explain it to him. But this happened about in the middle of September, and now that I realized kind of what was going on, my dad was getting ready to take my mom out for their anniversary, and I was trying to convince him to go back to the field with me to investigate, what it was, what made that sound. And he was willing to go, but my mom looked at him and said, Dean, you're not going anywhere. So fast forward just a little bit. Next week, I'm in school, and we had a library class in the school library, to teach us how to use, the library system, the Dewey Decimal System. Back then, probably nobody knows what that means. But anyway, it was identification on how to find books in the library. So we had this class, and the teacher she liked to know what it was that interested us. And the way to get that information out, she thought would be good to have a show and tell session prior to using the library. She wanted to know what interested us, and maybe she could steer us in that direction. So up shot my hand like a rocket when she asked us, did anybody have anything interesting happen this weekend? So I told my story in the same detail that I just told you. And about 30 minutes later, as the class had quieted down and everybody had a book that they were reading, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and it was the librarian, and she said, David, come with me. So I went with her, and she started grilling me about what had happened, and did I see the creature, and could it have been a cougar, could it have been a cow, could I have been mistaken? And I was just unflappable regarding what I had heard. And she said, okay, I have a book for you. And she says, this is an adult book, but I'll bring it in from the main library. I know it's there, but it might answer some questions as to what happened. And I said, okay, great. Get the book. Well, the book, it was Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. And that was written in 1961, and my experience was in 1963. So It was interesting that the librarian made that connection. But if you don't know what that book, it was kind of the Bible for a long time on all things relic hominid, Bigfoot around the world. It wasn't just about the Pacific Northwest. It was about what Darcy has gone into, which is the exploration of relic-type hominids all over the earth. So anyway, I made a great association and kind of had a interest in it ever since. Really didn't get back into the Bigfoot field until probably around 2006, after listening to a lot of things on the internet and attending a conference. I decided it was time for me to get out on the field, and it's been a wild adventure ever since.
Fantastic. Darcy, I'll bring you in now, if that's all right.
Yes, sir.
So, as David refers to there, I've also got a keen interest in relic hominids across the world.
Sure.
Primarily, if you want to pin me down, my other favourite outside of Bigfoot is the Yowie.
In Australia.
Yeah. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with 2 or 3 Yowie researchers down in Australia already, including the legendary Tony Healy. So, for you, what was your catalyst for this interest? Because, like I say, I've obviously a big fan of your documentary, but also I've really enjoyed the Beyond the Spectrum films that you've produced as well, which is obviously dealing with some other phenomenon, primarily aliens and abductions and things like that. So, what's drawn you into this mad world of Bigfoot and hominids?
Well, I'm obviously mad, is probably the easiest answer to that. Okay. But to be honest, I originally wasn't interested in the Bigfoot or cryptid question before 2015. I was invited out by a friend to check out a part of this rural area of British Columbia, Canada. I'm from Canada. I ended up meeting Bill Miller and Thomas Steenberg on this little familiar. It's like a term that travel agents use when they get offered a free trip somewhere to check out a new area. Mm-hmm. They call it a familiar. So I went with this friend on this familiar, and they had no interest in speaking to these guys that was in their itinerary, these Bigfoot hunters, these Sasquatch hunters. We call it the Sasquatch in Canada. Mm-hmm. You know, sitting down with Bill and Thomas, just over one day, my mind just completely cracked open. I was not closed down to the idea at all anymore, and I knew I had to go down the rabbit hole and find out everything I could about it. That led me to meeting Dr. Meldrum. I interviewed him and featured him also in my first documentary, The Unwanted Sasquatch. And when I was in his office, he had a pamphlet that was sitting on one of his desks. You know, he's got quite a few tables in his laboratory there. And I pick up this pamphlet and I said, "Oh, what's this?" And he said, "This is, a little pamphlet I've been putting together. I've been thinking about printing quite a few copies of it. You're welcome to have that one if you want." And I'm looking through it, and it says, Field Guide to Wild Men Sightings from Around the World. And I immediately was just drawn into that, and I'm saying to him, "Are you trying to tell me that there's, a Sasquatch type being that exists in different cultures from around the world?" And he said, "Yeah, there is." So I took that with me. I read it on my flight home and kind of put in the back of my head, I've got to do this project one day, because I think it would, first of all, make sense, because there's lots of historical truth and fact to many different accounts that have happened around the world in terms of wild man sightings. And if you think about it, Sasquatch or Bigfoot, which would be the same creature in North America, just two different names, they are wild men. They would fit the description of what is a animal like hominid that we've had plenty of evidence in the fossil record for these types of hominids existing in our past. And in fact, they lived on the planet the same time we did. I've said this before, I'll say it again. 500,000 to 250,000 years ago is when we started showing up, Homo sapiens, and we're walking the planet. At the same time, only 20,000 years ago was the most early fossil we found for Homo florensis, which would be the orang pendek. Some people believe Homo florensis, that fossil was found around Indonesia. We have the Gigantopithecus, fossils of that found that were, maybe 150 to 200,000 years old. And that means, for a good chunk of time, more than 50,000 years, we were bumping into them when we were walking around their habitat. There's no reason in my mind, if we're seeing so many of these reports of what would be recalled a wild man from the past, but living in deep wilderness, there's no reason that it's not still existing. These different types of hominids that are just in scarcer numbers living throughout North America, parts of Asia. In this new documentary, Sasquatch Among Wildmen, we basically talk about all these different sightings and the types of wild men local to each area in the world. So you've got, the Dev, which is in parts of Eastern Europe. You have the Yeren, which is in China. You have the Almasty, which is in Russia, and they also just call their Bigfoot a Yeti. And then you have the traditional Yeti, which came out of the Himalayas, which would be a different morphology to its foot, and its body would seem a bit more like a gorilla. So it all just tells me that this is a real phenomenon. This is real. And I've heard of the Yowie. I've spoken to some folks in Australia about the Yowie. I don't doubt that all of our continents at one time were connected. If we think back Pangea, and then we go further than that, and we have North America connected to Asia, Russia through the Bering Land Bridge or Ice Bridge. These are all points of time in which, if there were an ancient hominid that walked the planet and these continents were connected, these were all points in time when they could have migrated around what we live on now. So that's pretty much the case we present in this latest documentary. And what attracted me to Shane Corson and David Ellis and Derek Randalls and the whole Olympic Project thing was the fact that they had found these ground nests. They had found what looks like these really intricate woven massive nests in the Olympic rainforest in Washington State in the United States. And those nests parallel what was found by Yeren researchers in the Shenanjia National Rainforest in China. When they were hunting down and trying to find these Yeren, they came across ground nests. And they found hair samples in them, and they sent them off to be DNA tested at labs. And the same thing is happening with the Olympic Project, thousands of miles apart. And they don't even know that they're doing the same research. So it's incredible. I think it just points to the truth that is, this phenomenon is real. I was so happy to sit down with these gentlemen and find out more about their story and the research that they've been doing.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and I completely agree with your point of view there, Darcy. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I'm good friends with probably Britain's foremost cryptozoologist in regards to the orang pendek, Richard Freeman, who's been out to Asia 4 times searching for the orang pendek. So it's a creature I'm very aware of as well, and I completely agree with you. I think someone doing a series such as this and looking at all continents has been long overdue, probably since Monster Quest finished, because I think that was the last show that really tried to look at outside of the United States and Canada. So I'm really excited and looking forward to this new project from you, and I think after you've built Shane up, we've got to speak to him and get his thoughts on the matter.
I think it's all been said. I think I'm good.
Well, like I say, Shane, it's a pleasure to finally speak to you. Like I say, you're someone I've been aware of for a very long time. How on earth did you get yourself into the Olympic Project? Because obviously you're not from the neighbourhood. So was it a real passion that sort of... I mean, all power to you. I mean, like I say, the Olympic Project is something that if I'm ever lucky enough to win the lottery over here, I can guarantee you the first thing I'll be doing is booking one of the tours.
Oh, well, you'd be more than welcome, Paul. Definitely. If you make it stateside, just give us a ring and an email. We'll make that happen.
Oh, you can guarantee it. Thank you.
But, I was born in Glasgow, Paisley, Glasgow. I lived on an island off the west coast of Scotland called Islay.
Yeah.
And I grew up fascinated by cryptids in general, whether it was the Yeti or the Mokulemembe out of Africa or the Loch Ness Monster, of course. And definitely high on the list was Sasquatch for me. And so moved to the States in 93. And, growing up, both in Scotland and the U.S. here in San Diego, I've got my hands on every book I could read, every program I could watch. And I really started just gearing towards Sasquatch. That was my real big interest. And it wasn't until about 97 that, after I got some wheels underneath me, I could travel around, did I start venturing out to places down in Southern California and Central California, and then eventually Yosemite up in Northern California, where I fell in love. I never really found anything over the years of interest. I talked to during that time frame, I talked to a lot of interesting witnesses, and just didn't really find anything of interest out in the field, even though I thought, man, especially Northern California, not relatively speaking, not far away from, Bluff Creek, the Patterson-Gimlin film. I eventually met my wife and moved up to Oregon in 2008, and that's when I really started getting out. I'm an avid camper and a hiker, and I wanted to explore everything that Oregon had, because I did a lot of that in California, and Oregon just seemed like a place. Well, if Sasquatch is out there, this is it. And eventually in 2011, I had an encounter on Mount Hood while out backpacking, remote backpacking and fishing. Wasn't doing anything Bigfoot related other than just being an obnoxious camper with two buddies, and had this encounter, and that encounter solidified to me the existence of Sasquatch 100%. And I for a couple of months, I didn't go back out to the woods, but eventually I did, and I thought, man, I know where Sasquatch is. I know where they're at. I can prove they exist. And months later, I didn't prove anything. I was doing this solo stuff, going out by myself. And eventually I came to the realization I have to find other like-minded people. I can't do this by myself. And I eventually met up with one of Cliff Berkman's partners, one of his good friends, Will Robinson, and took him out, and we got knocks in this area, and he had equipment. And so I said, I need equipment. And kind of a long story short, I started going to a lot of different symposiums and stuff. I eventually bumped into Derek Randall's. Met up with him and went on an expedition with him, and eventually he kind of asked me to join the Olymp Project, and I've been a very happy member and core member ever since, and working with the likes of David Ellis and Derek Randall's, and just we have a lot of really good members, a lot of solid members with different attributes and different inclinations. We're all like-minded individuals when it comes to the Olymp Project, and and we don't argue. We don't. We just get down to the job. We just get the task done, and that's like I said, it's been a pleasure working with them ever since, and that's basically how I got involved with the Olymp Project.
Yeah, I think it is remarkable as well as you refer to there, and I'm not casting aspersions on anybody, gentlemen, but as someone that, like I say, I'm no expert, but I know a fair bit, and as David referred to there in regards to Ivan T. Sanderson's wonderful book, which was essentially the Bible on hominids in the 60s, Bigfooters are not known for their cooperative abilities, shall we say, if we're remembering the Four Horsemen and everything that went off back in Tom Slick's original investigations back in the late 50s, early 60s. So what's always struck me about the Olympic Project is it does seem, as you refer to there, Shane, a collection of the great and the good in the Bigfoot field. There is a wide variety of people from all over the world with different backgrounds and different skills, and I think it's testament to the project's overriding aims that you are all able to work and collaborate in such a positive manner, because the one thing I've always been struck about the work that the Olympic Project do is it's nothing too showbiz, it's nothing too far out there, it's very grounded. There's a hell of a lot of real science going on here, and it seems like it's a genuine attempt to try and finally put this mystery to bed and prove once and for all what most of us, well, certainly all of us having this conversation, are aware of, that Sasquatches are real.
Absolutely, and well said, and I appreciate the kind words there, but yes, the Olymp Project, we got so many different members from different backgrounds: biologists, wildlife biologists, trackers, hunters, outdoorsmen, even archaeologists in our. We got different backgrounds, and we mesh together really well because we're all the same idea of commonality in regards to this phenomenon. We do have skeptics in our group. Not everybody's had a Sasquatch experience, but even in some of these academic individuals that have never had this encounter per se, they know there's something to this, and they give it that kind of approach. They have that kind of approach. And so, what we've been doing for years is really just collecting data. We're a data source. We're not necessarily out to prove the existence of Sasquatch, but we definitely are about collecting the data. So if in that day, and I do believe that day is coming, when that day comes, that Sasquatch is proven, we will have this plethora of data and say, hey, science, here you go. So they're not, so they can kind of hit the ground running. So that's kind of, what I think makes us tick. We're all excited and very passionate about this stuff. And like I said, we just have such a great group of individuals And we put our head down and go at it. We don't have time to bicker with people. We, like you said, we're not flashy, Mm-hmm. We're not trying to put a bow on us, and look for every TV program we can do. That's why Darcy's latest documentary, Sasquatch Among Wildmen, was special, especially for me, because we don't do a whole lot of TV. We get approached, whether it's documentaries or TV series, and there's a lot of them. We get approached at least once a month, if not more. And almost 10 times out of 10, we turn them down because they want that flashiness. They don't want, they're kind of half in it for Sasquatch. They're about ratings and stuff, and they want your material. And I was very proud to provide Darcy with some material that's never been shared with before, and to sit down with him and join his documentary and his efforts. And I congratulations, Darcy, once again, because I think it's fantastic. Another fantastic job, well done. And so yeah. That's like I said, that's what we're about, and we just don't have time to bicker and argue with people, or that there's too much work to be done, and we really love what we do.
Yeah, I think that, like you say there, it's the collective amalgamation of so many skilled people, and I think this has often been the problem when it's come to the investigations in regards to Bigfoot, is that you've had small groups of people with very specific skill sets, whereas the Olympic project, as you refer to there, seems to cover all aspects of the scientific field, which I think has been sorely lacking. And I think that's the crucial point, because with the greatest respect, not everybody can know everything about what's required in regards to this search.
I know David's got to chime in here, but I'll tell you, you're absolutely right. David is a perfect example of that, of what he brings to the table. And we just have a lot of individuals like that. And you know what? I'll be honest with you, I love audio, and I love looking at audio and doing what David does, but it's not my absolute 100% passion. I love being out in the woods, and so I have my purpose, and I'm great with my purpose. I love my purpose. I do serve a purpose, as does every other member of the Olympic Project. And David, I know I'll shut up and let you jump in here.
Well, Shane, you've covered just about everything. I'm not quite sure where I could pick up from there and add to it. You explained perfectly that we are a group of folks that kind of specialize in a specific category. Not one of us are claiming that we find Sasquatch evidence. It's just that when we find something that may be possible evidence, we want to put it through the test. We need to prove that a cast impression, or an impression that's in the dirt that we cast, is actually something strange and not a bear. So, we have to eliminate all of the known possibilities before we can proffer another theory of what it could be. So we actually utilize what in science is called the null hypothesis, which is you don't prove the existence of Sasquatch, disproving that by saying, well, it wasn't this, it was a known animal. And when you can't come up with a known animal to balance against the evidence that you've collected, well, then it becomes suspicious and goes into that category, suspicious, until you find, oh yeah, we missed something. That really isn't suspicious after all. It really is a known creature. So we go about our business a little bit differently. We're not out to prove the existence of Sasquatch, but every time evidence comes our way, we try to vet it and disprove it.
Now, obviously, I've heard yourself and Shane speak previously on Monster X, just to prove that I do actually listen to it, and I'm not just, blowing smoke up your backsides, gentlemen. So you were discussing the fact that you are trying to build up a library of audio vocalizations to try and group them together, so it's almost as if we're building up a vocabulary.
Yeah, a gentleman that has been my mentor in the audio field is a gentleman that goes by the name of Monongahela. And he is a cryptolinguist trained by the military in that specific field. Yeah. So he taught me how to utilize software to analyze sounds in a spectrogram. So that bit of knowledge and his tutelage has really been a great deal of information for me that makes more sense, that I can translate what I'm witnessing or what I'm seeing versus what I'm hearing. So it's a great way to go about analyzing sound.
Yeah, because I know you were saying when you and Shane, like I say, when you were having this discussion, you were saying that obviously when we have an audio experience, sometimes our mind will try and pigeonhole it, or it will create its own sort of image in our brain. Whereas I think when you analyse the vocalizations and sounds that are captured, you tend to use a spectrogram, so you can actually see it, so you can see
right.
the pitch and the depth. Is that my understanding?
Yes.
Of that correct?
Yeah. The first point you were making is you're familiar with the term pareidolia?
Yes, of course.
That's usually associated with sight, where you see faces in clouds. Your mind tends to go to where it knows something. Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing in sound.
Yeah.
If you hear a sound that you're not quite familiar with, your mind is going to drift towards what is known. So if you hear a sound that is a howl, well, you're going to think in terms of a wolf, a dog, or a coyote. So you're going to, your mind is going to say, well, that's what that is. But when you get into the actual visual analysis, now you can start to separate the wheat from the chaff, because certain vocal signatures tend to show that, well, maybe this is not a coyote. I can't match these signatures up with known coyote sounds. So you go through that process of being able to look at it and hear it, and then you start to understand what it is that you're hearing with much more clarity. It's very hard for people to grasp that concept, that adding a visual component enables you to hear better, but it does. It does.
Yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate when I first started my show. I had the pleasure of speaking with Ron Moorhead. Who's obviously synonymous with the Sierra sounds, which the first time I heard them, they gave me goosebumps, because they were like nothing I'd ever heard before. And there's a very similar kind of reaction to some of the vocalizations that yourselves have caught, that you've been very kind to supply me. And I often wonder, and as I've heard you mention before, David, people will often say, oh, well, it's just a coyote, or it's a wolf, or it's a dog. And I, as you quite rightly point out, well, show me the breed that makes that noise then, and I can compare it. And that's obviously why you're able to use this visual tool, because it, I suppose, gives you a full range of the band.
Yes, exactly. So when somebody says, oh, well, I know that's a coyote. Well, number one, you don't know that unless you can show that.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not trying to be unkind to somebody that has a speculative opinion, but that's what it is. It's an opinion until you can actually show your work. So, when somebody has a contrarian point of view, all they have to do is provide me with a recording of what it is they're pretty sure that what they're comparing to is a coyote, for instance, and they know that they have a visual recording. Then I can compare it visually, and if there is a match, if the nuances are there, then I can say, you're right. That eliminates that suspicious sound now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's only fair, seeing as I've mentioned it several times. So this first clip was captured at Mount Rainier. It's about 25 seconds long, so I'm going to loop it and play it twice. See what you think.
regarding that vocalization, it was recorded on a cell phone, actually.
Wow.
So that should give people an idea that, if you hear something and you're familiar enough with your phone and know how to hit the record button, do so. And please send it to me if you think you have something that is really strange and out of the ordinary. But that particular area that it was recorded has some history of being an area where they vocalize. And this gentleman was just actually lucky enough to capture that. Recently, I did another podcast where supposedly an expert in wildlife biology had listened to some of my clips, but this is the one that interested him the most.
What strikes me about it is it sounds so mournful, David. There's a real sort of, without wishing to sort of prescribe personalities to what is going on, it sounds very sorrowful, in my opinion.
Yeah, the long vocalization is probably the most sought after vocalization by Bigfoot researchers. It is I don't want to say it's an absolute rare event, but if you capture one, you consider yourself lucky. Because it is probably a vocalization that you're not going to hear. It's usually something that's far away. That's why there's a huge echo component to it. But if you can think in terms of how much pressure would be needed to create a vocalization that could be a mile and a half away, and to be able to get that kind of a recording.
I mean, that is the thing as well, because obviously in a lot of reports and where people have managed to capture these, there does seem to be a real essence of distance involved in this as well, David.
Right, yeah. So I consider it a long distance vocalization. So, we can speculate from here until the cows come home just exactly what it means. But as you noted, there seemed to be a mournful tone to it, and I would agree with that assessment on this specific vocal. But I've been in situations where I have heard that type of vocalization made from one ridgeline, and then on another ridgeline, maybe 2-3 miles away, another one responds.
Yeah.
And so it is a form of communication, but what it means, we don't know.
Yeah. Like I say, when I've heard yourself and Shane talking, there seems to be a kind of train of thought here that there seems to be more chance of catching a vocalization at dusk and at dawn. It seems, and I think Shane mentioned it, that it's almost as if they're saying sort of hello and then goodbye at the end of the day. So they're basically just checking in and saying, right, I'm here, and at the end they're sort of saying, right, well, I've done now, I'm off.
Right. Yeah, it seems like maybe there is they seem to check in with one another now and then. I speculate that they have quite a range of travel. So being able to vocalize in this manner is a necessity.
Yeah, I think that also, if we're talking about creatures, because I think there's a real argument that perhaps we're talking about some kind of population that is migratory, for better or worse, I think. And clearly the vocal ranges that we've captured from around North America would tend to show that these creatures have got to have such a capacity to be able to communicate over long distances, would you suggest?
I would suggest that. I think that's a fairly logical conclusion.
Yeah.
I'd agree with migration as well, because even in the first documentary I made, you'll recall maybe 2 stories from that film, one of them being at Ruby Creek, which the Chapman farm was raided by a hungry Sasquatch. It ripped up the potato patch, stole some salted fish, and Mrs. Chapman ran off her property with her kids and got away, and the chain gang that was working down the way on the railroad, building a railroad in the 1950s there, ran back and investigated this, saw the prints, followed, the prints, tried to track down the creature. But this all happened in Ruby Creek, and this other hunter that was interviewed in the documentary by Thomas Steenberg, he had a rock thrown at him, and a massive splash was kind of unleashed at him when he was near this bog that he was walking through, and that was all in Ruby Creek around September. I think both incidents happened around then, and so some people, Thomas hypothesizes that September might be a migrating time of the year that they come through the Ruby Creek area of British Columbia.
Yeah, I mean, the Chapman case has a very sad aspect to it, because what I found remarkable, was it John Green that did the initial investigation?
Yes, back in the 1950s. He ran it in his newspaper up there in British Columbia, yeah.
Yeah, because the Chapmans obviously were First Nations people, and they believed that it was bad luck to see a Sasquatch. They'd had that kind of belief that if you saw one, you were gonna come a cropper or receive bad luck. And they tragically died, I believe, in a drowning accident, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yeah, unfortunately. They didn't want to live in that home anymore. It was pretty bad for their living situation, unfortunately. But I don't know. That's one thing that I think I should do is speak to more Indigenous elders and chiefs and try and extract some more information about how that family, lived and how that story of a Sasquatch encountering them affected their tribe, right? Because they're all very close. They usually look after each other even when they live apart. So that was probably hard for their tribe.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a case because, like I say, it's one of the key early cases that was sort of brought to mainstream attention. It's been reported in numerous books. Strangely enough, I've recently repurchased a copy of Lauren Coleman's Bigfoot book, and that talks about that particular case in quite some detail. So it was quite remarkable to rewatch your documentary, because, as I said, I've seen it more than once, and not just for the purposes of this conversation. It was nice to see that, because I think it's one of those cases that these days tends to get overlooked, Darth.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the more older tales just get overlooked. Everybody wants to hear about a YouTube video that's been posted or something like that, right? Or drone video. But I really think the historical tales are the best proof we have of this thing existing, because there's hundreds, if not thousands of them, from around the world, and especially the indigenous tribes of North America, the Native Canadians, Native Americans, they have tales going back for centuries talking about these things living in the forest, warning their children not to wander too far because the Zunaqua will take them, the Skookum. They all have their different name for what is the same creature, essentially. And, to have it in their totem pole, these ape-like creature faces and saying that's our Zunaqua or our Sasquatch is the word that Sasquatch came from. That says something. It means that they're identifying something that's part of their livelihoods when they have been living on the land and reaping everything they need to live off of the land. And they also have eagles in their totems or foxes or, something else that we know we can identify, okay, that's what this creature is. And, you look at David Ellis, he's going out and he's identifying, okay, that's a coyote, that's an elk, that's, a dog. Well, this sound is not any of those. What is it? And we look at these indigenous people's tales and they'll say, oh, well, that's a Sasquatch. You know what I mean? So
yeah. I mean, it is remarkable as well, because there are certain parallels as well with the indigenous Australians in regards to the Yowie. They're the very same thing, and I've often found that aspect to Sasquatch and the scientific acceptance of it quite frustrating, because, as you point out, there will often be murals or cave paintings or whatever, and it will feature a pantheon of animals that we're all very aware of. And yet, whenever you see something like a giant hairy man, oh, that's just a nightmare, that's a dream, that's a realisation of some kind of fantasy. And it'll be sat next to a fox or a bear, and you're like, well, hang on a minute, well, if it is, well, why is it sat next to something we know? And I think, for me, sometimes that's a real frustrating aspect to the sceptical argument, that you can ignore parts of indigenous culture, but just accept others wholeheartedly with no kind of contradiction.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, even the tale of the giant squid, up until modern history, was considered a figment of the imagination. People that were paranoid, men of the sea, that were saying they saw something, probably trying to strike a mutiny or something. But, we eventually got enough trace evidence, and there's the famous video now posted by Discovery Channel of the 26-foot giant squid that they found at the bottom of the ocean near Chichi Island off the coast of Japan. So, I mean, we've got video, we've got trace evidence of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and all kinds of evidence of the Yeren existing, or the Yeti in Russia. And the Russians quite adamantly will say it's real. They don't think it's a joke. And you look at the Yeren in China, and in the Shenanjia National Rainforest right near it, there's a actual museum where they dedicate it to the sightings of Yeren and the history of this being existing alongside the Chinese people throughout time.
Yeah.
That you can go and well, not foreigners, but the Chinese can. Yeah. And, Dr. Meldrum said he wasn't even allowed near there when he went over to investigate this. And that's just because the state keeps foreigners away from there's also apparently a military base near there as well. So they definitely want to keep foreigners away from that, just in case there's a security breach of some kind. Yeah, it's quite incredible that they embrace it, but then over here in North America, we're twiddling our thumbs over the subject.
Yeah, and if I can jump in real quick, with the science is so forgetful of all the major discoveries just recently brought to the table, including like the just 2017, the Tapanuli orangutan in Indonesia, where the natives there were saying, yeah, there's a population of these red hairy men, these orangs. Yeah. And Western civilization said no way. And eventually it was proven in 2017 that indeed there was a group of about 500 individuals in this area, and that blew the lid off of, blew the tops off of a lot of academics, because they didn't know how it was possible. Yet the natives there were talking about it for a long time. It was like a no-brainer for them. So very much, it always flabbergasts me how we don't take this, at least academia, science doesn't take it as, that serious, when we do have a ton of information and stuff readily available. And then you also have the First Nations here in, North America that talk about Sasquatch as though it's another tribe. It's a legit thing. It's not, as Darcy was saying, on the totem poles, they got orcas, they got eagles, they have all these known animals, and then they have a Sasquatch. Yes. Why would that one thing on that totem pole be just a dream or a mystical creature?
Yeah, exactly. And it is frustrating, Shane, because I think, as always, there's often this misconception in mainstream, and I know you guys have probably had to deal with this many a time, so apologies for sort of ticking an obvious box here, but everybody who's not into this just believes it all started in 1958, when I've often been really frustrated with that, because, as you say, we've got native legends going back generations, because obviously they didn't keep a written account, but it was all word of mouth and passed down, through storytelling as the tribes were wont. But, I mean, I'm lucky enough to have a copy of Chad Arnott's amazing The Historical Bigfoot, which has hundreds of stories from the late 1800s, 19th century, where people are consistently talking about wild men, wild people, gorillas on the loose, and yet we're all very aware that there's not a population of gorillas running around North America. And how many wild men were there? Because all these wild men most of them seem to have red hair and were very tall, and they all lived in quite unique locations away from people. And it's very easy, if you ignore the mainstream kind of guidance, as soon as you get past that and you start to look into the historical record, it's there in black and white from all across the United States and Canada.
Yeah, and actually, to your point about this whole phenomenon not just starting up in 1958, we were on another radio show quite recently, and we mentioned Albert Ostman, who is a pretty famous Canadian prospector. He lived up until 1975, and he said in the 1920s, when he was a little boy, he was abducted by a Sasquatch. He was taken, and he was lucky enough to get away. He was held and captive for apparently 6 days. And, this affected his whole family. It was documented, and he came to the media and told them these things are real. I was taken when I was a kid. So it's like, it didn't just start in 1958. It's always been here. It's just that we have such an incredible ability, I think. There's a really interesting man, I think his name's Graham Hancock.
Yes.
Yeah, Fingerprints of the Gods.
Yeah.
He mentions a theory which I like, which is, we all suffer from cultural amnesia or historical amnesia. Meaning something happened in the past that was so cataclysmic, that changed our world so drastically, so quickly, and was, so full of panic and pain that a lot of people just lost their minds or something and forgot. I feel like, if there was some kind of cataclysmic event that happened in the past, it may have shaken our minds and made us forget that we're sharing this land with all kinds of different beings that are not us. And perhaps before then, there was a greater acceptance of that truth. But we're modern men now. We're surrounded by computers, cell phones, TVs, and we're constantly being pummeled with what is the ultimate truth, which is the mainstream story. And all of these other truths are coming from the fringe, and we're expected to shun those and treat them as a joke or unacceptable. But why is there thousands of UFO sightings that happen every year, or hundreds at least, around the world? Why is it that there's still Sasquatch or Wildmen sightings from around the world? It's because these are real things that are happening on the periphery, but it's just not accepted by mainstream science. It's not accepted by mainstream media, and now mainstream media is waking up to the UFO subject in a bigger way, because we're getting some official disclosure from the Pentagon, and Stephen Bassett says he's pretty sure this is going to be the year that there's going to be congressional hearings about it. But why is it that this subject doesn't get the same respect and get the same acceptance? Why like I said this before, and I'll say it once more, does the Pentagon have to release videos or pictures or something in order for everybody to be like, yeah, that there's something to this?
I think it's the arrogance of knowledge often will just make us push things out of the way that are uncomfortable or inconvenient, I think. And when it comes to cryptozoology, that is often the situation. And I've mentioned this before with a couple of guests. I was lucky enough to have Micah Hanks on talking about Bigfoot. And we were basically saying, cryptozoology is not the only academic branch that suffered from faking. This is the other thing, as Shane refers to there, that certain aspects seem to be forgotten or ignored. That in all fields of science, be it chemistry, biology, physics, there have been notable fakes and evidence put forward for alleged experiments or realizations that, under scrutiny, were simply not true. And yet they're all pushed to one side as though it never happened, and everybody moves on forwards and nobody talks about it anymore. And that often seems to be how this is dealt with, I think.
I agree with that. I think it's still incredible to me that it doesn't get accepted, considering you have people like Dr. Meldrum, that is a mainstream scientist, and you have what's the individual that's out of New York State, Todd Dissidell, who also will consider this subject and has done his research. And Todd Dissidell helped in doing some DNA studies for Jeffrey Meldrum and such. He's out there. He's taking into consideration the reality of this thing being real. But there's just not enough academic involvement. There's not enough acceptance towards it. And unfortunately, we live in a society where the great filter is the media. It's the mainstream media or the government, and I feel like the mainstream media will only follow that, will follow up a truth or start to publish something once the mainstream government does a release of their own. And we know the FBI has done investigations of some of these cases that have happened over the years. We know that the police have been involved in many sightings throughout the years in the United States and Canada. What would it take for those records to be released?
Yeah, very much so. Well, we might end up with a situation where somebody has to leak something, like obviously that's gone on with the Tic Tac videos. Regardless of what you think of them, that's basically pushed the US government into a corner where they can't get out of it anymore.
I'd say so, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one other thing Darcy's mentioned before in some of these interviews is money. Money it's always a factor in regards to specifically Sasquatch. A lot of these universities, you'll never, like Dr. Meldrum, he'll never see a grant from the university to look into this further. I mean, everything he does is on his own time and his own dime. Yeah. And so it really is a money thing. And so it's a dang shame, but that's reality.
It is, and it's also professionally dangerous for somebody like Dr. Meldrum, because as we're all sort of throwing it about here, people will be looking down their noses academically at Jeff, and thinking, what on earth is he doing? Oh. Whereas for me, I mean, my stepfather was a scientist, and I was always brought up to believe in exploration, evidence, the search for knowledge, regardless. And you have to push the boundaries. And so when it comes to these kind of subjects, I'm often very frustrated, gentlemen, that there is this wall that everybody seems to hit, and anybody that's brave enough to climb over this wall is just basically becomes a pariah, as Grover Krantz did. That they're basically ostracised by mainstream science and academia. At dinner parties, people will be pointing, oh, there's the Bigfoot guys, and that kind of thing. Which for me is the antithesis of what science is supposed to be about, regardless of what field it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well said, Paul. I mean, to a T. There have been a lot of individuals, a lot of academic individuals that have looked into the subject matter. Many of them having their own experiences, maybe that launched them into it. But regardless, they had put their neck on their line. The late, great John Bindernagel, biologist, wildlife biologist out of Vancouver Island, was a perfect example. Yeah. He couldn't believe that mainstream science without the subject was so taboo. So Grover Krantz mentioned, Dr. Meldrum, John Mainzinski. There's a lot of different academic individuals that have kind of come out of that closet. But I will say this. Project Zoo Book's a project that I'm associated with. Amy Boo created this project called Project Zoo Book, where both field researchers, investigators, and academia can meet up and have intelligent conversations on this. And there are a lot of academic individuals. In fact, there's one that just reached out to us from Wales. I can't mention any more than that right now, but a very interesting chap. But back here in the States, a lot of different academic individuals are still kind of in the Sasquatch closet, as I call it. Yes. But that are they're this close to coming out, and they're getting bolder and bolder, and this younger generation is creating a unique conversation that I'm very optimistic about the future of this, and it's just waiting for this whole thing to explode, to have these guys and gals and different individuals truly come out of this Sasquatch cause. But until then, I would say God bless those that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and by that I mean the ones that came before us, like John Bindernagel and Grover Krantz and Rene DeHinden and all these guys. Moving forward, we just got to make sure we don't let those guys down and stick our necks out twice as far as they did, because they truly put a lot of their work on the line.
Yeah, and I think it is important for all of you, yourself and David and the other individuals involved in the Olympic project, because I was speaking to Philip Mantle, who's a celebrated British ufologist, and he was saying that he's got to a time in his life now where he's considering where's the next generation of ufologists, where are the younger people? And I think we were in danger of having that in regards to Sasquatch and the exploration and investigation of the subject after the Four Horsemen, and how it kind of seemed to be drifting away from at the beginning of the 90s. It's crucial that it's done in the right way as well, because we're all very aware, and I'm sure David's a prime example of this, the amount of nonsense that gets perpetuated as Bigfoot. Darcy, went in your Unwanted documentary, Paul Freeman's in there, and I'm not wanting anybody to kind of throw any mud here, but obviously there are numerous people, and it's not a modern thing. Obviously there are people like Ray Wallace and Ivan Marks, going back to the birth of the Sasquatch legend. Whenever I see Ray Wallace's name mentioned, sure. I move on to the next subject. But even though now, gentlemen, it's probably the hardest it's ever been for real tangible evidence, because there's probably hundreds of people out there simply looking for something to go viral.
Yeah, we've noticed the stigma, so we know exactly what you're talking about. What's kind of interesting to me is I heard a percentage, and I don't know the validity of the study, but it was basically saying, if you take 100 people, only 30 will claim that they've ever heard of the term Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So, it's still not really on the consciousness of most people. So, and which makes it ripe for people to create these hoaxes that you're talking about, Paul, and perpetrate them on people, because there's most people think that it's a silly notion. So creating those kind of circumstances doesn't help. But I always go back to conversations that I had with John Bindernagel, and I know Shane had the same conversation. But Dr. Bindernagel wrote a book about science and why they won't take a look at it, which is fairly enlightening. I can't think of the name of the book off the top of my head, but you should read everything that John wrote. So he had quite a notion. He's actually said, there's enough evidence right now to prove that Bigfoot exists, and why science doesn't look at it is beyond my it really did frustrate him all the way through the end.
Book is The Discovery of the Sasquatch, Reconciling Culture, History, and Science in the Discovery Process.
You got to read the book.
Okay. I think, Darcy, in your documentary, he does actually say that science is no longer science. It's become a belief. It's dogmatic.
That was John Green, yeah.
John Green, yeah.
And that is a criticism that has come to that has been cast at science, even in terms of looking at gravity and the universe. There was an article that was published just yesterday that dark matter may not actually exist.
Yeah.
They've just proven that there's some possibilities that dark matter does not exist. And, you've got the CERN particle reactor in the middle of Switzerland and that area of the world that's basically trying to find dark matter. And, they're spending all this money and time because of something that an earlier scientist had a discovery of. And what happens too often is that when you're going to these universities and you're taking part in a certain academic career, you have to basically accept everything that came before, all of your predecessors in that field as gospel. You can't, contest it or say, that's wrong until you really have some proof of it. And unfortunately, you know, even if people are giving tons of proof to anthropologists and wildlife biologists that there's this thing called a Sasquatch or a wild man relic hominid still existing, they don't want to hear it.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Darcy. It's very frustrating. I think we need to play some more audio now, and this one is titled Raw. And once we've heard it, David, if you don't mind, you can give us a bit more background. Here it is.
This falls under a category that I had, that I'm following, that's grunts, growls, huffs, roars. That seems to be a lexicon, if you will, a collection of sounds that they utilize. And this was, I don't know how else you could describe this particular vocalization other than it was just a quick roar.
Yeah. So where was this captured?
I believe it was here in the state of Washington. Not too far from where we do most of our work in the Olympic Mountains.
Yeah. So is this... I mean, for me, it's very interesting because there are numerous different types of vocalization. And I know we touched on it earlier on, David, that you're trying to collate this library. Is there a specific categorization that you are able to have these days, or is it essentially you're still getting new vocalizations that perhaps are pushing the boundaries of what you considered or expected?
Well, I can go through a list of sounds that I'm following by name, if you like.
Yeah.
One of them is called baboon bark.
Yeah.
And I can kind of give you a little story about that.
Yeah.
You've heard of Daniel Boone, one of our frontiersmen in the early 18th century. In the Appalachian Mountains, he was famous for tall tales and stories, and supposedly, air quotes, he shot a Yahoo. So I'm on the internet doing a search looking for maybe a little bit more information about the story. Sometimes things kind of percolate up, and as I was doing a search, up popped a YouTube video called Wahoo, the Baboon Bark. And something kind of clicked, and I went, no, I got to check this out. The similarity between Wahoo and Yahoo were too close. So I did. I looked at it, and as I was listening, actually it's a video, as I was watching the baboon make this sound, I went, I've recorded that.
Yeah, so let's listen to the baboon bark.
You know, so it was kind of a serendipitous moment, an epiphany, if you will. And so I went back and I found the vocalization, and I was able to compare it. But then I realized, you know, I'm going to go back and listen to a few other sounds that have been sent to me that I have clipped. And so sure enough, this sound is, I've had people send it to me from all over North America, you know, 4 or 5 different states. So that particular sound went into that specific lexicon.
Yeah.
So I had, I think I sent Michelle maybe 4 or 5 clips within that particular lexicon.
So to get an idea of what David is referring to, 6 years ago, an orangutan named Tilda was recorded using vocalizations by her keepers at Cologne Zoo in Germany. This news report from the time gives us an overview of the very talented Tilda.
New research suggests a female orangutan that calls a German zoo home is believed to communicate with her keepers in human-like manner. Named Tilda, she doesn't rely solely on her natural sounds to attract a person's attention, but instead she often mimics what are thought to be human vocalizations. Tilda appears to show speech-like patterns by both controlling her lips and tongue, as well as manipulating her vocal folds. In order for her to produce the consonant-like noises, the orangutan clicks her tongue, which in turn creates varying tones. This vocal action is similar to how humans pronounce consonants, such as B. In another one of her calls, she produces grumbles in a way that is comparable to how we make vowel sounds. According to the study, Tilda only makes these sounds during feeding time when zookeepers are with her, and often adds gestures, such as pointing to the food. Researchers use both audio and video recordings to study her communication methods. The lead author of the paper that is now published in PLOS ONE told Discovery News, "It is our belief that Tilda learned to produce these calls from humans while she was in the entertainment business."
Well, after making Tilda's acquaintance, let's have some more clips in regards to what David was saying about grunts, howls, and some vocalizations that have been recorded in the field.
Right there, just see movement right through there.
I mean, some of those, David, are just absolutely remarkable and just show a real range of vocalizations. So what other categories do you use then in regards to that, if that's what's covered in sort of grunts, growls, and vocalizations?
Let's see, what other ones are wood knocks, and then there's this specific tonality to a voice that I call the crow talker. Yeah. It sounds like a crow talking, and people can say, well, maybe it was a crow talking. Yeah. Well, not at 3 a.m. in the morning. Another percussive sound that I'm following is called drumming. Mm-hmm. You hear these percussive beats in a syncopatic style that reminds you of somebody hitting a drum. Yeah. And it's not just once, it's numerous times in a pattern. One of them is so intricate, I called it John Bonham reprise.
Hey, that's some good drumming. Well, I think after that build-up, we'd better listen to some of these drumming examples. So here's 3 clips that David has very kindly supplied me to use, and the final clip is the one we've just mentioned, which is entitled The Marvellous John Bonham Reprise.
Yep. And then one that you just played, a category of sounds, grunts, growls, huffs, roars. Maybe one of the stranger things that I've come across is percussive voice. Now, that's my term. Nobody else is using that particular term. Yeah. But I can tell you another quick story about how that came about. I was on an expedition with a witness that I was working with, and we went to a location where my wife and I had heard wood knocks. Other people had encounters in this particular location, and we went there just about dusk, the witching hour, as we kind of talked about before. And so we're standing there, I'm recording, and all of a sudden the witness that I was working with, he's about 6'6", 6'7", 300 and plus pounds, and he starts backing up and he's running me over. Like, what the heck is going on? So I said, Steve, calm down. What's going on? He said, Dave, I just watched a Sasquatch walk between two trees. So even though it was dusky, he could still see the shadows and identified this. And about 30 seconds later in the recording, you can hear these staccato sounds of something banging on something. It sounded like. That's what I had thought. Well, when maybe 7 or 8 years later, I'm reviewing it visually because I have that capability now. And as I'm looking at that sound, I went, wait a minute, there's way more to this than just hitting something with sticks. And as I was looking, I could see that there were huffs and grunts and other vocalizations within it. And then I realized that this is probably mouth pops that I'm hearing, not like a stick hitting a wood or anything like that.
All right.
So, and the sounds were like somebody was speaking. And then I realized that this seemed to be some sort of speech. And if I believe that there's a certain tribe in Africa where they incorporate mouth pops and clicks in their speech. And that's what this sounded like. So then I realized that that's the sound that I need to be paying attention for. Other people from across the country, it's another one of those sounds that people are recording and they have no idea they're recording it. So that's one of the things that I look for when I get a larger clip from somebody. So that's one of my lexicons that I'm looking for. Then there's a term that Scott Nelson, who worked with Ron Moorhead, alerted researchers to, and what he looks for is a term that's called phoneme streams, which are sounds that are vowels and consonants that are strung together that are the basis and the concepts of speech. So that's what he was able to glean from Ron's recordings was phoneme streams. So there's I have myself and others have recorded some phoneme streams, not necessarily that sound exactly like the Sierra sounds of Ron's recordings. They have some different relationships, but you can hear vowels and you can hear consonants, so they fit that term.
Yeah. So is that what is more commonly known as the samurai chatter then, David, or is that?
Yes. There's another group of vocalizations that seem to carry a note. And go up and down, undulate. And I call that singing, and have recorded numerous audio clips, or I've gleaned audio clips from recordings where that fit this particular category. And again, that's across North America. Voices. This is a tough one. There seems to be an ability to mimic certain short sounds. And specifically, I've got a scenario of a witness I was working with where they had several dogs, and something was calling the dogs by name. One of them sounded just like her husband, except her husband was in Florida at the time. So it wasn't him.
Blimey.
There's other categories: whistling, whoops, the long vocalizations that we've covered, and maybe one of the most common sounds is what I call the gorilla chest beat, because it sounds like a gorilla doing its chest beat.
Yeah.
And I've got recordings that compare that same slapping noise that they make on their chest, again, across North America. So these are sounds that are recorded in areas where people have seen Sasquatch. They're having activity. That's why they're recording. And so these sounds seem to be repetitive from, one place in North America to another, 3,000 miles apart, and they're making similar sounds.
Yeah, well, that I find quite interesting, because obviously there is also a train of thought, David, that the hominids that are seen in the southern areas of the United States are not exactly the same kind of thing that is seen in the Pacific Northwest, such as the skunk ape or creatures such as the folk monster and the like. So when you're getting these vocalizations from across the continent, do they all seem to fit in a similar pattern, regardless of the area, or are there distinct linguistic differences depending on the areas you're getting them from, if that makes sense?
You mean, is there a southern drawl?
Maybe.
Nice.
Oh gosh. We're gonna wade into the weeds. There are patterns of sounds. They don't all necessarily have the same tonality as, one could say Paul is speaking English and David is speaking English, but they sound completely different.
Yep.
So I find that kind of a similarity, if you will.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly wasn't expecting them, to have a bit of a twang. I'm just, I'm not that naive. My perception is that, obviously, if we're led to believe that the skunk ape looks like it doesn't look like a Bigfoot, if you get what I mean. So, for me,
yeah.
I would find it surprising that it would sound the same. Not that it would all go, y'all, I'm not suggesting that in the slightest. But I would be more surprised that it sounded the same than it was slightly different.
Well, here's one. I can't really reveal too much of who I'm doing this with, but there is a recording that I was reviewing this morning that is very similar to recordings that I have made, but it's in a different octave or key or resonating, and it's resonating in a higher pitch, but it has all of the same visual characteristics that I would say, well, that's a suspicious vocalization right there. And one could speculate that maybe there is it's a female, or maybe it is a juvenile, that hasn't had a voice change yet, if you will.
Yeah.
So.
Fantastic. So this is all just adding more meat to the bones of the investigation then, David, that you're able to start building up a fuller spectrum of vocalizations and noises that are difficult to pin down.
Well, I am certainly to the point where I could use professional assistance. I'm doing this all at an amateur level, noticing things that pique my interest. So one day that person is going to come, our paths will cross, and we can take a look at it in an in-depth look. But I'm at least collecting the information, making the observations ready for somebody to vet.
Yeah, fantastic, because I think a lot of people just presume it's just whoops and wood knocks and that's it, but anybody that's got a real interest in this subject and obviously knows your work specifically, David, will know that there's far more to these vocalizations than just those.
Correct.
Fantastic. Now, Shane, there's one aspect that I'd like to pick up with yourself, if that's all right, and it was a very interesting theory that I'd never ever considered. I know when I was mentioning the conversation I heard you and David having last year at some point, you were talking about nests. And it's an aspect I've never considered, that nests must serve a purpose of some kind. And you were discussing the possibilities about disturbing something because you discovered a newer nest rather than an older nest. And that was an aspect of the whole phenomenon, with the greatest respect, I'd never ever given any real consideration to, because you just presume a nest's a nest. But clearly, if they are what we believe they are or hope they are, they must serve a purpose. So I found that bit of your point fascinating, because I'd never considered that. As you were saying, you were concerned that you may have disturbed something and put it off doing whatever it was doing, because clearly a new nest is being built for a specific purpose, is it not?
Absolutely. Before these particular, or the original nest find back in 2016 was brought to our attention, I really didn't. I had read historical reports about bedding and nests and stuff. I just really I never come across anything that nature. I've come across some weird formations and stuff like that. But these ground nests, when they were brought to our attention, and we really studied them for over 4 years now, and found multiple nests in the same the same general areas, but they were all very similar, and not just construction, but where they were built and how they were built. So, yes, you look at these nests and you go, okay, a nest's a nest. That's a place where something could bed down and sleep. And, and then you get into, okay, well, why this area? Well, you got, you're well hidden. You got plenty of food. You got basically a nice little cabode for a spell where no one's going to bother you.
Yeah.
But then you start thinking about, well, these nests really are only found by certain individuals for the most part, historically speaking. These timber surveyors. So you got that aspect, and they're rarely found at all. And I would expect that if Sasquatch is making nests on a regular basis, they would be, a lot more would be found. They'd be more noticeable. Because these nests won't deteriorate right away. It'll take a good year for them to really start dilapidating, and depending on, of course, tree fall and rain and wind and snow and all those factors, obviously. But they stay their main shape for over a year. So we would find more of these, in my opinion. So you just start thinking of all these aspects and talking with the. I had this idea that maybe, possibly, based on the size of these nests, where they were located, how much time it took to build one of these things, that they may be built for a specific purpose. And that being possibly like a nursery or a birthing area, based on the number of nests and the size of these nests, including 2 nests that were built off the ground in huckleberry bushes that are very small nests, not something you would necessarily lay in. It's too brittle, but made in the fashion of these ground nests. And gorillas, of course, as I mentioned before, can teach their young to build this sort of nest as a practice sort of scenario. So you have that factor. And talking with a gentleman who's in your neck of the woods there, he lives in London, and he does his name's Wes Lim. He's giving me permission finally to. I always call him Squatchermetrics, and that's his that's his handle on Facebook and Instagram. But
yeah,
Squatchermetrics, fascinating guy who's data driven like us, and it's been a pleasure working with him. And for your listeners, if you're really into data and analytics, please check out Squatchermetrics on Facebook and Instagram. He's doing some amazing things. One of these amazing things he brought to my attention as something we've been working on is the huckleberry leaves and the huckleberry plant itself, which all of these nests, including this newer one that my partner Todd Hale and I came across, were made out of huckleberry boughs, huckleberry branches, and huckleberry leaves. Well, this new nest area, that was in the making, like I said earlier, Todd Hill and I, partner of the Inland Project, walked right in on something, gathering this up and compiling what looked like was about to be built into a nest. A tremendous amount of huckleberry branches. One of the things that we did notice in this area after studying it was the huckleberry leaves were in many cases plucked and in piles. And I can only wonder if that was going to be part of the bedding, maybe the softer part in the middle of a nest as it's being made and constructed, or in fact if possibly it was going to be ingested part as meal. And Squatchometrics, Wes Lim, he brought to my attention that, he asked me a question, what are the medicinal purposes of huckleberry leaves? And I had never thought about that in 4 years. I never really thought about it. Obviously, huckleberries come off of the huckleberry bush, and they're delicious, and they're like grapevines at certain times of the year. There's so many. I never thought about the leaves, even though I was considering that Sasquatch would eat the leaves. A lot of known primates do that, not just for food and nutrition, but also for water source. So I thought, huckleberry leaves. Well, it turns out that they used to give human women, after childbirth, a mixture of sugar and huckleberry leaf to help them regain their strength after childbirth. And he brought that to my attention. I thought, well, if you're making a nest, say Sasquatch is indeed making these nests. And you got, all these different food sources, but then you also have the medicinal purpose of the huckleberry leaf after you give birth to regain your strength. What a perfect scenario. It's the perfect storm. And maybe, just maybe, that's why these nests are being made, is for that purpose in these remote areas. And maybe I compare orangutans to Sasquatch all the time for many reasons. They got a long howl. They're very solitary, and they build nests. And they give birth every 6 to 8 years. I often believe that Sasquatch, and this is all conjecture and hypothesis and ideas, but I often think that Sasquatch probably gives birth to something along orangutan every 6 to 8 years, and so it's a very rare occurrence, as are the nests. Now, these nests we've been working on from 2016 to 2020, 21 now, but 2020, end of February, we came across this brand new nest 4 years later in an area we've been searching and hoping to find older nests for the first couple of years. The first 2 years, we came across a total of 22 nests. The rest of that time, we didn't really come across any new nests, and we were looking in different ravines and different areas in the Olympics here and not finding anything. And then come February, the tail end of February 2020, we come across a brand new nest in the making. Maybe it's an area where they travel when there is a male and a female, obviously, ready to mate and procreate and give birth. Maybe it's not just a seasonal thing. You need the perfect storm sort of scenario where you need that female and male, but maybe it's every 4 years. Maybe it's every 6 to 8 years that these individuals can give birth or will give birth. It's just a lot of interesting things to think about. But the huckleberry and the areas that these nests are made really lends credence to my thought that this is a birthing scenario, and it's a very special scenario. And as you stated before, I did feel guilty walking in there and breaking this up after the fact, because there was so much work in collecting these huckleberry boughs and branches, a foot off the ground to 8-9 feet off the ground, and just a lot of work. And we disturbed it, and it did not come back.
Yeah, but it is an aspect, like I say, Shane, until you pointed that out, I'd never given that any real thought at all, which I think is just one of those things in regards to this whole phenomenon. I think there are so many aspects of it that we perhaps overlook, or we just don't consider in the depth that it probably deserves, because for a lot of us, we've got the vocalizations, we've got the sightings, we've got footprints, and I think it's the minutiae of these aspects, such as nests. Do they give birth every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, whatever period? So it's phenomenal in regards to that, because it one discovery tends to give us so many other questions that perhaps we've not considered, or we just need to continue collating that aspect of the evidence to keep building different portions of this phenomenon. It's like a giant jigsaw, and every time you think you've got it sorted, another piece appears, and you're like, where's that supposed to fit?
Yeah. So absolutely, so true. The more you find, the more questions you end up having. But a lot of this stuff just plain makes sense, and that's something I think that's very important to look at. A lot of this stuff, you think it'd be common sense, or you think that, we should have thought of that, and you don't. It takes either discovery or working with a group of individuals like I work with in the Olymp Project to spark an idea that will send you down a road of thought and testing. And so that's really what's important about groups like the Olymp Project. And there's other good groups, great groups out there and individuals. But, sometimes you think you know it all, and none of us really do, but you think, okay, there can't really be any other discovery other than let's find a body or a bone, but then you find something along these lines of these nests that just flip your mind and blow you out of the water. And it just, what a ride. But man, I hope there's more discoveries like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so gentlemen, thank you so much for a fabulous conversation. I'm sure you can probably guess I could keep you here for 5 hours, but I'm sure you've got lives to lead rather than speaking to some strange man in England. So, first of all, Darcy, when's the documentary going to be coming out, and where can people get hold of it?
Right, so Sasquatch Among Wildmen is available right at this moment. You can check it out on Google Play, Amazon Prime, iTunes, to name a few. My other films are also available through a lot of those platforms, so you can check out my website if you want and see some of my film posters, trailers, and click through and see the films on sites that you can watch them on. So my website's www.occultjourneys, JOURNEYS.com. And thanks for having me on again, Paul. Great show, and you're an expert in this field, I'm convinced.
Well, thank you very much. I'll make sure I put links in the show notes for everybody for that. David, Shane, where can everybody keep up to date with the Olympic projects, and what else you guys are up to coming forwards?
Well, I can personally, actually Shane as well, we can be reached at olympicproject.com, and we have a tab there for contacts. Feel free to drop us a line or relate an experience. And or for me specifically, if you'd like to send me an audio recording, drop me an email in the contacts, and we'll connect, and I'll get that sound to me. We have several methods to do that, but I'll need to talk to you via email to secure that. So I can be reached, and Shane can be reached at olympicproject.com, our webpage.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, your consideration, and your conversation. It's been fabulous to finally get you on, and I hope that you'll consider coming back one day for even more conversation and educating me even further than my love of Sasquatch currently stands.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, especially since you're so very knowledgeable on the subject matter. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.